So today we're going to be talking about Wendell Berry's story, Pray Without Ceasing. Where did everybody go? Oh, do you want to have the little, well, whatever, just leave, whatever.
Okay.
So Wendell Berry is, I like to say he's one of my favorite writers, although I want to talk about that in just a little bit.
They're on mine.
Oh, okay. That's nice. As long as you can see. So Wendell Berry is still with us. He was born in 1934 in Port Royal, Kentucky. Port Royal is a little town on just off the Ohio River, a little bit to the northeast of Louisville in Kentucky. And the short story that we're going to be talking about today is set in the fictional town of Port William. Port William is modeled after Port Royal and is on a tributary of the Ohio River. He was educated at the University of Kentucky. He's taught creative writing and American literature at Stanford, NYU, and the University of Kentucky. He did that until 1977, and after that, he has been an organic farmer and a writer. And so when he writes about farming, local farming, organic farming, he lives what he writes about. He's won many awards. His basic message is that humans must learn to live in harmony with the natural rhythms of the earth or perish. And I think he would take the view that although there's some signs of hope, we're probably closer to perishing than we are to learning how to live in harmony. So a picture from a couple of pictures of him, and I'm very light on pictures for this, so I apologize for that. But as a younger man, you see him at the top as he is now in his Zoom room, I guess. They're at the bottom. So let's go to the next one. Oh, I think you have to keep going because
okay.
We're going to skip these for right now. These are some quotes from various places. Let's just go ahead and get them all up there on the screen real quick. One of the things that he is most concerned about in both this short story and his other writing is the importance of community, the sacredness of place, and the importance of time. So if you listen to Dean Cade's sermon this morning, you're going to hear a reflection on time. And Wendell Berry, it fits in very nicely with Wendell Berry. If you go to the one more little arrow key, there's one more little quote down there. And okay. One of the things, if you like something a little shorter from Wendell Berry, he's written a number of poems. He's won many awards for poems. This is the last little quote: "Be like the fox who makes more tracks than necessary, some in the wrong direction, practice resurrection." That many of you will know is from a somewhat longer but still very manageable poem, one of the Mad Farmer series of poems. And the admonition to practice resurrection is one that I think bears lots of time reflecting, and he would suggest using time to reflect on it. Michael, if there anybody who has any comment or anything, I definitely want to hear other people's voices than mine. So, but if not.
So far, good news, no one's sleeping, but also no one commented at the moment. So
okay, that sounds good. Well, let's move on. Let's move to the next slide. One of the things that I think is there are going to be two little slides with graphics. This one is a map of Port William. And this appears in several of his writings. It's easily available on the internet. I don't think Wendell Berry drew it, but it's fairly common. And it helps to visualize, at least it does to me, where all these things are taking place. And so if you had a chance to read the poem, I don't have my little cursor, but Michael can probably find right in the center of the map a reference to Thad Coulter.
No, it is not my cursor. It's
It's
not
okay.
appearing.
It
Okay.
does matter. And then a little bit to the left, I guess, of Thad Coulter is a group of homes in the town of Port William, which is a very small community. Anyway, this gives, yeah, so that'll zoom it in a little bit. And these are the important people. And if you go farther to the left, you'll find the road along the river to the county seat of the county in which Fort William is located, or is fictionally located, called Hargraves. And Hargraves is, like I said, the county seat. It's 10 miles away, and that road and that town figure prominently in this story as well. So let's go to the next story, or the next slide. This is a genealogical chart of the various people in Port William. And if you know William Wendell Berry, I'm sorry, you'll know that he has written a number of novels, basically called the Port William novels, I guess, and a number of short stories. And they're basically all about this little town and the town over time, over history, and the relationships of the people in this town. And I'm not going to go through the genealogical chart. That would not be very helpful, but I think it's important to note that this is the community. This is a group of people that we're talking about. So if we go to the next slide, we'll talk and just flip on down through that. Well, no, we'll do the first arrow. This story, of course, Pray Without Ceasing, is, has a reference to one of Paul's quotes of one of his letters in 1 Thessalonians. It's actually verse 17 in chapter 5. And the verse is, rejoice always, pray without ceasing, give thanks in all circumstances, for this is the will of God in Christ Jesus for you. And we're going to come to this little reference a little bit later, but go to the next one. And I think that this is very consistent with the narrator of the story, whose name is Andy Catlett. His grandmother, who told him the story of what happened back in 1912, is introduced by a brief description, a word picture of the grandmother. And we'll go to that quote in a little bit, but basically the grandmother, though she was not an Episcopalian, could easily have known about the definition of prayer from the Book of Common Prayer, because you'll note that, a lot of people say, well, if you go to the next slide too, or the next arrow, there we go. This is just taken from a little quote that I found. I'd always thought praying without ceasing was really hyperbole. Paul stressing the importance of prayer by telling people to do it all the time. I didn't realize it was actually possible. If prayer is not just talking to God about stuff, but instead is anything we do to respond to God, and that's, of course, the Book of Common Prayer's definition. Prayer is responding to God by thought and by deeds, with or without words. So the quote continues on, if instead it's anything we do to respond to God, then it is possible to pray without ceasing. To do so is to cultivate a constant awareness of how each of our actions is done as some kind of response to God's action in our lives. Each action we take or thought we think puts us in either greater or lesser resonance with God's movement. By cultivating this constant awareness, we are praying without ceasing. Any comments at this point? If nothing else, it just gives me a pause. So
one observation I can make about
please.
Praying Without Ceasing, in formation in a monastery, one of the things they try to get across to the novices is this idea of praying without ceasing, in that your actions during the day can be offered as a prayer. You try to get into a mindset where you're open to hearing what God has to say to you, and then you can go about the tasks that you're assigned to do. And therefore, the very actions of working in the yard or whatever you're doing can become a prayer, because they were teaching us that, we certainly join in prayer several times a day in the choir stalls, praying the Psalms, but you can be praying at other times in the day simply by forming your mind to be receptive.
Yeah. Yeah. So I think that's what so this is going to be important. And Linda's already said, gee, there's an interesting title to this story. And I do want to talk a little bit more about it in a little bit, but let's go to the next slide. There are a lot of people in this story. I mean, unlike what I think John Ragsdale's story last week, Short Easter, there were not very many people involved in it. A lot of times, I guess one of the things about short stories is, well, you're focusing on one or two people, and you don't really have a whole raft of characters to deal with. Well, Pray Without Ceasing introduces pretty much many of the people that are involved in Port William. The little numbers to the side are the page on which the characters are introduced. And there are a lot of people that are very important in the story. I'm not going to go through them right this second, although one of the things that I would like to do is to suggest, and I think Wendell Berry would probably be okay with this, is the last character that I think is important in this story is Port William. Just the place itself. I know that's not strictly literarily true, but from a historical point of view, which is more the way I look at things, it's I think, very consistent with the way he would look at the way this story. So just in case you haven't had a chance to read the story, because after all, it was rather long, let's go to the next slide and we'll kind of go through the basic story. So first, Andy, and the character is not named for a good long while in this story, but the narrator, at least to start with, is Andy Catlett. And he reflects on his grandfather, Matt Feltner. And there's a reflection and if we have time, we'll look at one of the quotes about his reflection on Matt Feltner and the importance of time, his sense of the notion that time is very important in dealing with relationships and understanding people. Let's go to the next little arrow. So it starts out that Andy is given by a person that I'm not going to talk about, but one of the many characters in the story. Andy is given a 1912 newspaper clipping, headlined, "Ben Feltner, friend to all, shot dead in Port William." And Andy realizes he knows little about the shooting of Ben Feltner, his great-grandfather. And that's an interesting point. He didn't really know much about the fact that his great-grandfather had been murdered. And he didn't know the circumstances until he got this newspaper clipping and decided he would kind of investigate it, but nobody had talked about it. His grandfather, Matt Feltner, had not reflected on it, not told him the story, and that's talked about a little bit later in the story. But he gets this article, and then he goes to Port William, which is just a couple of miles away, to see his grandmother, who tells him the story of Ben's death by a man named Thad Colton. And it's interesting, just as an aside, Andy is one of his. He is a Coulter himself. I mean, he's part of the Coulter family, and that becomes important as a reflection on how this all plays out. So the story that his grandmother is a very important person in this story. Wendell Berry talks about women, I think, in a very interesting, he writes about them very interestingly. And there are several very important women in this story. One is Andy's grandmother, and another one is the daughter of Thad Coulter, the killer, whose name is Martha Elizabeth. So anyway, the story goes on this way. Grandmother's story is Thad was in financial distress due to the failure of Abner, his son, in the grocery business. So Thad got drunk. He went to see Ben, his best friend, for support. Ben listened for a while, but then told Thad that he needed to go get sober, and then they could talk. Then, at that moment, Thad hated Ben. He kind of stayed outside of Ben's house, kind of stewing. His daughter, Martha Elizabeth, came to get him, and Thad resolved to go get his pistol and kill Ben. And we'll keep going. And so Thad, and he does that. He goes home, he gets a little bit to eat. His wife and Martha both try to convince him to not go, but Thad is in a drunken rage and he is not going to be dissuaded. And as soon as Thad leaves the house, his daughter, Martha Elizabeth, sets out to try to make sure that he stays out of trouble. She's always going to be a few seconds behind him. So Thad tracks down Ben, who had gone to Port William. This was a Saturday afternoon, and he kills him. And the story, the killing, takes place in the space of about a paragraph in the story. Then Thad runs toward the county seat, 10 miles away. He takes his mule. He starts riding his mule very hard to the county seat. He realizes pretty quickly that his moment of exhilaration in killing the person who's not responding to him is over. And he realizes he's made a big mistake. So we go to the next arrow keep going. So Matt, at about the same time, Matt Feltner, Ben's son and Andy's grandfather, is also in Port William. He's taken one of his animals to be shoed at the local blacksmith. And so he's gathered with other men at the blacksmith shop. He hears the commotion, and he hears and finds that his father has been shot dead. Everyone tells him that it was Thad that shot Ben. Mm-hmm. So we then get the next character introduced. His name is Jack Beecham. He was a friend of Ben's, and he was kind of someone who had always watched over Matt. And I'm doing a very great disservice to the paragraph where Jack holds Matt so that Matt becomes a stronger man than he had been. In other words, basically, Jack knows that Matt is going to get ready and try to find Thad immediately to kill him. And Jack knows that that's going to be something that Matt is going to regret for the rest of his life. And so Jack basically holds him down until Matt can sort of calm down a little bit. But in that moment, Matt becomes a stronger man than he had been. Thad makes it, and all this time, Thad is making it to the county jail, and he turns himself into the sheriff. The sheriff is really highly perturbed that Thad is turning him in. He knows that Port William is a violent, place, and it's late Saturday afternoon, and he really wants to go home for dinner. And Thad is turning himself and confessing that he's killed this man. So the sheriff says, okay, fine, let's lock you up. And almost as soon as he makes his way back from locking Thad up and taking the gun away, Martha Elizabeth arrives to inquire about her father. She agrees that Thad is the one that killed Ben, but she wants to see him. The sheriff says, no, you can't do that. So Martha goes out and waits. The next thing that goes on is that it becomes the rest of the people in Fort William become aware, including Ben's wife and the rest of the family, becomes aware that Ben has been shot. And so his body is brought home and they're gathering for the wake. I don't know if you grew up in a small town, doesn't have to have been a southern town, but if you grew up in a small southern town, you know, when people died, they were basically taken home and laid out in the front room. And people didn't have an Irish wake by any means because they were good Baptists after all. But the men might have gone out and had a few drinks. But basically, people bought their food and cakes and so forth. And the one of the local ladies, Della Budge, comes to Matt's home with a cake. And she states her mind that basically it was Ben's time to go. It was, you never know when it's your time to go, whether it's by man's hand or God just chooses it. But basically, it was his time. So we must always be ready. Pray without ceasing. And Matt says, okay, and whatever. So a little bit later that night, and of course, this is going on all this time, many men from Port William come to Matt's home. They say they know who killed Ben and that they want to put justice beyond question. We have a rope. And then we go to the next part of the story where Matt, and we'll look a little bit more deeply at this paragraph in just a second, but Matt stands there. He's the son. He's the one that can give him permission to go and string up Thad at the Hargrave County Jail. And he tells them he appreciates their willingness, but I have to ask you not to do it. Mm-hmm. His mother gets up, says, pretty much the same thing. And then Matt basically invites them all in to share a meal. And that was, as Wendell Berry says, that was the longest public speech that Matt ever made in his life. And the men, the lynch mob breaks up, and the story ends. And the story concludes with Andy reflecting on his grandfather, what happened in the Feltner family and in Port William after that. And the other thing that happens is that Jack, the man who held down Matt at the very beginning when Thad had shot Ben and Matt found out about it to kind of keep him from giving in to his murderous rage, says, okay, my work basically is done, and he rides off into the night. And that's the end of the story. So
I'm curious, I'm wondering if anybody has any thoughts about Della's idea that, she states her mind, it was Ben's time to go. Because that struck me as odd.
Everybody's so shy this morning.
I know.
Matt, it pretty much reflects a theological perspective that God is omnipotent, and if he died, then, was God's will.
It's very Presbyterian.
Yeah. Predestination. Yeah, we went, Calvinistic kind of. Free will, but that's in direct contrast and tension with Matt's decision not to pursue vengeance.
Mm-hmm.
So it's very interesting. I also wondered whether, Joe, you thought that the farm itself was a character, because when you began to describe the story, you said that Dad was in financial difficulty, but it was more than that. It was his whole life was going to disappear. Everything that he'd worked for, everything that the land he had held in trust, his son obviously violated that trust. And there's something about what we hold in trust, whether it's friendship or property or family. So I just wonder what you thought about that.
Well, You're absolutely right. No, I think that that's completely correct. In fact, there's a paragraph, and it's not one that I chose to quote because I got too many as it is. And this story is packed full with lovely descriptions of various things. But there is a wonderful description of when Thad has just come back from the bank, who has basically told him, look, we're going to have to foreclose our mortgage because basically, as I think I said, Thad had supported his son Abner in trying to set him up in a grocery business, and he basically mortgaged the farm. And so when Thad is coming back from the bank, knowing that he's going to have to either work forever, and he says, I'm 60, I don't know that I'll ever be able to work long enough to pay off the debt for my farm. He comes back, he sees the farm, and it's where he's grown up. I mean, it's where he's lived for 60 years. And it's been everything. And he knows that other people might look at it and say, well, this doesn't look like much, but it's everything I have. It's everything I've ever had. So Linda, I think you're exactly right. I could easily have put, and probably should have put, the farm. And it's not only that farm, but it's others as well, because everybody's farm, is that way. So yeah, I think you're exactly right. And that's, again, a reflection of the importance of place on this. In fact, one of the quotes that Wendell Berry put in a more succinct frame of mind was, there is no such place as an unsacred place. There are only places that are sacred and desecrated. And the places that are desecrated to him are ones where either an agribusiness has taken over farms and run small farmers out of the place, or places that where people just don't pay attention to the land. And sacred places are not those places. So that's the dichotomy that he makes. Any other thoughts?
Nina?
Back to Della.
Yeah.
Her comment about it's Ben's time. The first thing I thought about was, when men go to war and women, is it their time to die also?
Yeah, that would be her view. Yeah, I think that would very definitely be her view.
When I see stuff like that, then I try to think broader about it. How is it affecting today's world? And that's how I felt about that comment.
Mm-hmm.
So,
but like some others have said, I mean, for Calvinistic religions, and that's the Presbyterians and Baptists are very Calvinistic as well. And I'm sure there are others as well. Mm-hmm. This is very much consistent with that theology. So.
But there's also that powerful description of a woman who has lost 3 of her children and doesn't wear bright colors anymore because she lives with a world that is full of grief.
Mm-hmm.
So that's another piece that we know that death is always in the room with them. And I would think that anybody who's a farmer knows about failures and animals, and there's a cycle, sometimes within your control, but mostly not. So there has to be some place to put the deaths.
But as people, we pray for people to get well, for them not to die. We do all kinds of things to continue our life. So if we just thought God has our time to come and go, we wouldn't do these interventions to try to stay.
Yes,
Yes.
yes, definitely.
Mhm.
Let's look at, there are several themes in this story that I'd like to just mention, just look at real quickly, and then I maybe want to do one or two quotes from the story, one or two passages, because our time's running short. And so, Michael, if you could just kind of flip through them real quickly. The
Sure.
importance and sacredness of place. We talked a little bit about
Right.
that. The vast scale of time involved in any event. How is the past present? And Andy Catlin. And I would suggest, and I think Wendell Berry would ask, how is the past present in each of us? Then obviously, what is the possibility of forgiveness? What does that look like? And what's the relationship between forgiveness and justice? The mob wants to represent justice. I mean, that's the word that the spokesman for the mob said. Andy doesn't talk about forgiveness in those terms, but clearly his heart is softened and he does not want to extract vengeance or justice, if you will. So let's go to the next one. Another is the importance of male mentors. And I know there have been any number of people who comment about Wendell Berry, who love the notion that Wendell Berry has many strong men. I mean, there are lots of men in these characters or in his stories, and some of them are certainly not strong male mentors, but there's always the importance of male mentors in these kind of communities. And then the role of women in Port William. And there are two particularly in this story, Andy's grandmother and Martha Elizabeth Coulter. And this is, so I don't know if there are any other themes that that you identified. Those are just ones that came to mind to me. Any others?
Well, I'm thinking about who represents God in this story.
Yeah, say more.
One of the characters is Jack Beecham.
Yeah.
That holds everything that Matt is experiencing and holds him in safety in some ways. But I think that Matt himself will say later in the story, I am the son of my father's forgiveness, or something like that. I can't remember the exact quote. I am the child of his forgiveness.
Yeah.
I think there's a piece about where faith lives, partially in the telling of the story, or Della with the cake coming to say, a reminder, a little God reminder there. Martha Elizabeth, or what is that her name? Martha Elizabeth?
Martha Elizabeth, right.
Yeah. As the one who comes alongside. And there's a whole beautiful.
Anybody that I would, if I was going to pick one God representative,
yeah,
I would probably pick Martha Elizabeth, because she has no control. She doesn't try to assert control over this, over her father. She recognizes her limitation, that in the notion that he has his free will, whether it's clouded by drink or rage or despair or whatever. But when he goes to jail, she is there. She stays with him. In fact, well, anyway, she stays with him, and he kills himself. I didn't mention that part. He kills himself that night. Thad takes his own life. And then she goes home. And then the reflection that Matt makes is, well, Martha Elizabeth wasn't an outcast in this small community. I mean, everybody knew that she was the daughter of this man who killed his best friend. And yet she was seen as someone who was very much a part of the community, who had discharged her responsibility as a daughter, who had done the best she could, and who was a valuable member of the community. And she lived to a ripe old age, and but she had a shining moment in the fact that she stayed with her father while he was in jail. So, but I think you're right. I mean,
She also pursued him when he was lost, right?
that is right.
So she's, but I think that, faith comes in many guises in this story. She may be the most fully formed, but I think it's everything from how the community handles death to, I just think it's multi-layered. And that's how he had started the story, about the layers.
Right.
Yeah.
In fact, let's just look at the first quote, the very first way this starts.
Or you do want the quote at the top of the page?
Yeah. Mhm.
That the one up.
Yeah. Go to the next. Yeah, the next arrow.
Okay.
Yeah,
All right.
just the quote.
Okay.
There you go. This is from the very first page. Laura, would you read that?
Mac Feltner was my grandfather on my mother's side. Saying it thus, I force myself to reckon again with the strangeness of that verb was. The man of whom I once was pleased to say, he is my grandfather, has become the dead man who was my grandfather. He was and is no more. And this is a part of the great mystery that we call time. But the past is present also. And this, I think, is a part of the greater mystery we call eternity. Though Mac Feltner had been dead for 25 years, and I am now older than he was when I was born, and have grandchildren of my own, I know his hands, their way of holding a hammer or a hoe or a set of check lines, as well as I know my own. I know his way of talking, his way of cocking his head when he began a story, the smoking pipe stem held an inch from his lips. I have in my mind, not just as a memory, but as a consolation, his welcome to me when I return home from the university.
So I can't improve on that. I just point to this as being a wonderful reflection of, and I think a very true, to me, it's a very true reflection on family, on relationships, on how we are who we are. Any comments? Because our time is about up. It's about, and I know we need to leave in less than 2 minutes, or 2 minutes or so from now. So any thoughts about this?
I have one that's very recent, but it's about a berry. When I wrote my last book, The Wheatley Family, well, one of them is married into the Berry family. And as I traced it down, I found a young woman in New York. And she had written a book about her father. Her father was killed in World War II. And the message that he had been killed was given to her mother the day before she was born. So she knew nothing about her father. 50 years or more later, the town that the plane went down in made a monument to this man because the man had saved the town, and another pilot also had helped save the town by letting their planes go down. So this woman's mother had all the letters that her father had written to her, and she writes a book about those letters, and she gets to know her father, and she is a Berry. In fact, I tried to trace Wendell down to this particular family, and I'm almost sure he is kin to him. because they live so close together. I mean, an area.
Yeah.
But this book is amazing. In fact, I could not even write anything other than what the very woman in New York had said to me. I said, I cannot improve on it. So I wrote what she said. And it was just like she brought the whole 50 years to herself that she didn't know about herself. Well, more than that, because I guess her dad was born in the 20s, and she was born in the 40s. So it's fascinating how she got to know her father. In fact, another of the Berries wrote a story, a history about a church in Kentucky, but over on the other side. And I tried to find out if Wendell was raised in the Christian church, because most Berries are raised in the Christian church in Kentucky, but I couldn't find out where he was raised.
Well, he definitely is a Christian, but as commentators write, he doesn't go to church very much because he thinks that churches have not done a good job of helping people avoid going to war. So
He was
anyway,
raised in the Christian church. Number one, he had communion every Sunday. The people that started the Christian church were from Scotland, and they felt that the churches should all be one community, that it shouldn't be divided up. And so that kind of gave me a clue about possibly him being in the Christian church, because it was so prevalent. It was major church in Kentucky.
yeah, it may well have been. I mean, the folks who settled in Kentucky often were, well, of course, they came from the Appalachians and were largely Scots-Irish. So they would have been, lowland Scots or, Presbyterians.
Well, they majorly came from Maryland and came
Well,
from
the people from
Yeah.
Maryland, yeah, would have come from, from that place originally. So
yeah, they came
Yeah,
from Cumberland Gap.
I think Wendell Berry would comment more about that, because even that part of the past, going back that far, a little bit farther than this paragraph is referring to, is going to be very much a part of who we are, who he is. And so this is just one of the reflections. There's a lot more. There's some just beautiful writing, I think, in this.
Oh yeah, yeah.
And I wish we had more time to talk about it. If I were a better manager of time, we would have done that. But well, so
You've
anyway.
done a great job with this.
It's going to be
Well,
over.
there's a lot more to it. So if you didn't get a chance to read this, I would encourage you to do it.
Okay.
If you
And
if you
the
have read
newspaper.
it, there's some wonderful passages.
Oh,
in
and
it.
everything's open, so don't worry about that.
So Michael, do we need to, I guess we just need to wrap it up, because people need to do other things this morning.
We do, and next week we have another offering, Carol Bly, the story Baptism. And if you haven't discovered already, Nancy Purcell, the communications director here at the Cathedral, has put a number of these stories on the Cathedral's website. If you go to the tab that talks about learning and then come to this faith forum, anyone that she could find that she could put in PDF form, she's actually loaded the story there. So if you don't have another copy of it elsewhere you can read, you can often find it on the Cathedral.
And Dad, come in a few minutes because the church service is going to start.
Yes.
It's too bad that this was not a short story, Joe, so that we couldn't get all of your wisdom for the length of it. So is there a way that we can see what else you wanted us to pay attention to?
Well, it's all in the PowerPoint that, and Michael may be able to put it up on the.
I will send the PowerPoint to Nancy and she'll be able to post that on the website. Yes.
Thank you.
Okay.